And let me just read to you, we're just going to look at a few verses this morning from chapter 2, verse 5 to verse 9. So let me just read these to us. It says, "It is not to angels that God has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. But there is a place where someone has testified, 'What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honour and put everything under his feet.' In putting everything under him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. Yet at present we do not see everything subject to him. But we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honour, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." So I think I've got a couple of pictures again just to on the wall as we go. I've sort of likened the first part of this letter in chapter 1 to almost like to a giant great game of top trumps. I don't know if you've ever played top trumps during your life, but as you can see there, we went to visit Ellie a couple of months ago, and she got something like the top British hunks or something. And they've all got their categories, sex appeal, charisma, style, likability and fame. And you get a different score and you sort of compare and all that sort of thing. And the beginning of this letter, we've seen the angels being mentioned again and again and again. And Jesus has been compared with them by the author, as I think the video just showed, because the Old Testament law, Deuteronomy says, and the New Testament says, came from God to Moses and the people, but via angels. And so there seems to be this link in the people that the author's writing to, that if the law of God came via angels, then surely as Christians we need Jesus, but we also need to be keeping all these various things that the law talks about. And so what the author is doing in this kind of top trump type thing is just showing that actually Jesus is far superior to the angels, and we see that again and again and again. Now the author's not, I should say, I thought about this as I was coming down this morning, the author's not against angels. In verse 7 of chapter 1, the angels are God's angels, they're God's servants. In verse 14, God uses angels to serve the church. So the author's not against angels, he's just saying that Jesus is on a whole different sort of level to the angels. And again we see that Jesus is the Son to the Father, verse 5. All God's angels in verse 6 of chapter 1 should worship him. He's on such a different plane. So he's been building this case, and when we get to our first verse today, we read sort of almost like the final category of the top trumps, where he said, "It is not to angels that God has subjected the world to come." So it's not, the world to come is not for angels. He's not subjected the world to come to angels, but he's subjected it elsewhere. So I think if we go to the next slide, the world to come is the first thing. I'm going to just focus on three quick things this morning, the world to come. And notice in verse 5 that he says, it's not to angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. And I want you just to glance down at your Bibles now to chapter 1, because you may not have noticed that throughout everything we've seen so far in Hebrews, the writer is pointing us constantly ahead to the future, to the world to come. Once human history comes to an end, God's plans beyond then. So just glance down at chapter 1 verse 2. Notice one of the descriptions of the Son of Jesus is that he has been appointed the heir of all things, the world to come. Verse 3, after Jesus had provided purification for sins, we're told, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven, so raised and there forever. In verse 8, we're told that the Son's kingdom will last forever. In verse 11, we're told that this world, the heavens and the earth, will be rolled up like a garment, so they will perish, but the Son, Jesus, will remain forever. Verse 12, like a garment they will be changed, but you remain the same forever. Verse 13, God says, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. God's plans for the future. Chapter 2 verse 3, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? And the word salvation there means deliverance in the end from God's judgment. So it's a future perspective. So the writer has constantly got the future, the world to come in his mind. And clearly the Son is going to be the centre of all of God's plans for the future. I had a bit of a falling out recently with my duvet cover. It got a little hole in it, right on a seam, right on the bit underneath my chin. And now and then at night, as I'm sort of moving about, I just hear a little tear. And the little thing goes a little bit more, and then a little bit more. And then it got so big, I started to think, okay, I'm going to need to get some sort of sewing done here, or some sort of replacement. But of course didn't get round to it. Every now and then another little tear, until one night I went to get out of bed, and I'd got wedged. The sort of seam had actually wedged over me. So as I got to get out of bed, I was wrapped up in the entire thing. So very easily then, the duvet cover was removed, it was rolled up, it was sort of put to one side, and then brand new duvet cover is put on. And if you read back in chapter 1 and the sort of verses about Jesus there, where is it, verse sort of 11 and 12, speaking about the heavens and the earth, there you go, the heavens and the earth, we're told in those verses that they will perish, they will wear out like a garment, duvet cover. You will roll them up like a robe, like a garment they will be changed, but you remain the same, your years will never end. Just as sort of easy as it was for me to sort of roll this thing up and remove it and make it new or replace it, so Jesus will do with the world to come. He will call an end to time. This world as well will perish. It will be rolled up. It will be changed. It will be made new, and the Son will be at the centre of all of that. So there's a big focus on the future, on the world to come, but there's a little bit of a surprise, I think, in verse 6. Because as you read verse 5, it says it's not to angels that he's subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. Now you'd expect him, I think, to say, but actually the world to come has been subjected to Jesus. Top trumps. He's superior to the angels. But actually he takes a bit of a different route than you'd expect in verses 6, 7, 8, 9. Look what he does in verse 6. He says there is a place where someone has testified, that's like us, that is, who know it's in the Old Testament somewhere, but we're not really sure where. So somewhere it says, he kind of opens with that phrase in verse 6, there is a place where someone has testified. And what he actually does there is he quotes from Psalm 8. What is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him, humankind, a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honour and put everything under his feet. In putting everything under him, God left nothing that was not subject to him. So the big point here is he doesn't just say it's not to angels that he subjected the world to come. He actually says, let me tell you about who God has subjected the world to come, and he immediately takes you to human beings, which is sort of unexpected. He says, let me tell you about what God did. He created human beings, verse 6, and notice he is mindful of them and he cares for them. He made them, he's mindful of them, he cares for them. He made these creatures called human beings a little lower, like on Mike's dad, a little lower than the angels, not sort of supernatural beings like the angels, a little lower than the angels. But he crowned them with glory and honour in his world, and he put everything under their feet. And what Psalm 8 is doing, really, Psalm 8, when it was written, is a reflection on Genesis 1 and 2, the very beginning. God created, says Genesis, human beings to rule over his creation. To rule over, as it were, the heavens and the earth. Lovingly placed by God as stewards of all that he has made. And I want to almost just take a very brief pause on that point and say, isn't that an incredibly high view of human beings? We live in a world, don't we, with all sorts of people viewing and treating human beings in all sorts of ways, whether the unborn, the young, throughout all our years, the elderly, how we view each other, how we treat each other. These verses tell us that God is mindful of us. God cares for us. God has placed us as his image bearers, if you like, on this planet. He's crowned us, verse 7, with glory and honour. We're made in his image, unlike anything else in all creation. And he's placed us in this incredible position of governing and ruling and stewarding his precious creation. It's an incredible thing for every one of us and for every human being to think, who am I? Where do I derive my value, my purpose? How do I view myself? And the Bible sort of partly answers that here, doesn't it? That God has created you. He has made you. He's given you life. He's mindful of you. He cares for you. He made you a little lower than the angels. He's crowned you with glory and honour, and he's put everything under your feet. And yet, as we read on in there in verse 8, it says, in putting everything under him, God left nothing that was not subject to him. So we were there to rule the whole creation. And yet, the writer says, at present we do not see everything subject to him. And that's true, isn't it, really, when you look at our world, look all around us. We do not see a world that is sort of perfectly subject to us and under our rule and control as God had intended at the beginning of creation. The weather, presumably, I don't know, in the beginning, all things were subject to us. I don't know whether that means that somehow the whole of creation was subject to human beings. We just need a typhoon, don't we, to blow through Japan, causing havoc, causing rugby games to be cancelled and obviously devastation. We have no control over that. The ground, the whole sort of image, Genesis picks this up of farming and the ground and working the ground. And there are now problems that we encounter. We got rid of this sort of manic bush in our front garden that was sort of just dominating and destroying everything. We thought, we'll get rid of that. We'll replant some lovely things and, work our garden. I just see our gardener on the balcony smiling. We'll get our green fingers and we'll tame this tiny little bit of land. But the thing that we removed does not want to go. I mean, we have dug and dug and dug. This thing is like, it's a plague. There's no hope. We have to bring in Jack Faulkner and bring in the big guns. This thing, cannot be tamed. We don't really, I don't think, rule the animal kingdom in the way that God intended in the beginning. Don't we, of extinction now for so many species that have happened and are likely to happen, the way that we treat the animal world and so on. What about relationships with other people? We celebrate, don't we, many relationships. There are many good things that we can rejoice in and be thankful for. But there's also a fair amount of wreckage. And there's a huge amount of pain and hurt in that area as well. Things are not subject to us. We don't see them in the way that they should have been. And even our control and sort of stewardship of our own selves. I think Paul in the New Testament says, the good that I want to do, I don't do. And the stuff I don't want to do, I find myself doing. We're not even in control of ourselves. And then, of course, and this is significant for the last bit of what I'm going to say this morning, but for a lot of next week, that, of course, in this sort of loss of control and things not being subject to us, the greatest thing, I think, in all creation now that stands as a testimony that we don't have the kind of control and stewardship and rule that God had intended in the beginning, the biggest thing that stands there and shouts at us is death. We are captives. We'll see this later in chapter 2. We are captives, it seems, in the face of death. We are its prisoners. We are powerless. It is not subject to us. And in that sense, God creating us and crowning us with glory and honour and subjecting us things to us, and even the idea of his world and the world to come being under our stewardship as we're under his power, it's death that ultimately stops that. Because death wins every battle. Death ends our ability to reign and to rule. So it's not it's not angels that he has subjected the world to come, but rather the author says, Let me tell you about these wonderful creatures that God made and subjected his world to. Us. He says we do not see everything subject to humanity now, verse 8. And then he moves, I don't know which slide, let's go to the next one. Which will... That's what we've just been talking about. God giving the world, as it were, under the sort of stewardship and care of humanity. But at the moment we don't see the world that way. But, he says, verse 9. Have a look at verse 9. This is our last verse, key verse. Mike's spoken to us a bit about this. But, he says, what do we see? We do see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honour, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In the midst of the messy picture we see in the world today, the author says we do see Jesus. And Jesus, remember chapter 1 verse 3, is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being. Jesus is the imprint of who God is. He is the image bearer extraordinaire. And he was made a little lower than the angels for a little while. He was made a human being. The Son becomes one of us. I've been thinking quite a bit about Christmas recently. I went to a sort of local church leaders thing earlier in the week. Everybody was talking about Christmas. Everybody was sharing ideas, different things that they've done over the Christmas period in their churches. Last night we've got let me just tell you, we picked up a lamp yesterday from IKEA in the As Is section. We picked up the lamp for me, for my room, to go on my desk so that I can see. And within 5 minutes of being home, as I came into the living room, the fairy lights were on, the candles were lit, and my lamp is now on top of the bookcase and is now going to be in the living room. So I need another lamp. But the fire was lit, and Henry came off for a bit of dinner. He walked in and he said, it's like Christmas in here. And so Christmas has sort of been on the mind, and this is essentially what we're seeing here in Hebrews, that the ultimate image bearer extraordinaire, who is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, was made lower than the angels just for a little while, as Mike said. He was made a human being. The Son became one of us for a little while. That's the technical term is incarnation, God coming into his world, God with us. And the writer says, now we see him crowned with glory and honour. Remember chapter 1, sat at the right hand of the majesty in heaven, triumphant, his work finished, his salvation complete. And we see him, the one who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now seated at the right hand of the majesty in heaven, crowned with glory and honour. And the question in verse 9 is, why is he there? Why is he crowned with glory and honour right now at the right hand of the majesty of God? And the writer says in verse 9, he's there exalted, glorified, because he suffered death. He suffered death. That's why God has now raised him and placed him at his right hand. And by the grace of God, the writer says, he suffered death for each one of us. He tasted death for everyone. He died for us. He died a death so that we need never die it. Isaiah 53 says, he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. And the punishment that brought us peace with God was upon him. Incredible sort of news that the writer's showing us here is that we need never pay for our sins. We need never pay for our iniquities. We need never bear the punishment that we deserve. Because in God's great kindness, he not only made us and is mindful of us and loves us, not only did he crown us originally with glory and honour and put everything under our feet, but because of the mess we made, God himself took a human body, suffered death in our place in order to deliver us and save us from his judgment. And having been raised from the dead, death is now under his feet. Death is now subject to him. Death is now a defeated foe. And as we're going to see next week, which is just some lovely imagery next week in the second half of this chapter, and I'm desperate, I need to resist the temptation to sort of say too much about it now. But let me just say in a sentence that all that Jesus does in the rest of chapter 2, all that he achieves, he does it for us. And there's connections, and if you want to think about anything during the week, have a look at the word pioneer in the rest of this chapter and what that means. Everything he achieved, he did for us. Everything that happened to him is now true for us. And so death could not hold him and death cannot hold us. And so what do you see at the very end of the picture in the Bible? In the world to come, you see Jesus ruling and reigning over the world to come, and we rule and reign with him. Which is an astonishing thing. And that's why, in all the time we've just spent, the author didn't just say, and now my final top trump. God has not subjected the world to come to the angels. He's subjected it to Jesus, is what we'd expect. But what he's just shown us in these verses is he's not subjected the world to come to angels. Actually, he's subjected it to humanity, the ones made in his image. But we have failed in our sin, and so Jesus, the image of God, was made like us, and he has succeeded. And in his death and resurrection, he takes humanity, the original ones that will look over his world, he's taken humanity with him, and we will rule and we will reign with him at the end. It's a little bit mind-blowing, but it's an incredible thing that not only did God make you and give you life, not only is he mindful of you and cares for you, verse 6, but he gave you a great responsibility, and he will bring that to pass. But only as Jesus puts right where we failed. So all the glory and the honour is his. But if we trust in him, the world to come, he has great plans for us as his image bearers and his ultimate image bearer. Well, let me just finish. Chapter 2 verse 3 says that how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? And just want to encourage you this morning that if you do not know Jesus Christ personally, there's a wonderful opportunity here as he calls you to come and put your trust in him, to thank him for that death, that he died for you, that he was pierced for your sins and iniquities. He's paid the price that you can be reconciled to God. So there's an opportunity this morning to thank him and to put your trust in him and ask him into your life. And again, the note of Hebrews constantly for those of us that are Christians here this morning is keep on following, keep on trusting, don't turn away. God has this plan for the whole of time. Let's just take half a minute, I think, just to pray personally, to speak to God, to respond to what we've heard, maybe to thank him, maybe to trust our lives to him again, and then we'll celebrate communion together.